Hello beautiful people, welcome to this video. Welcome to my van. About 6 months ago, I bought this van with the intention of building it out so that I can travel and have my home with me wherever I go. It's been a really incredible process so far. I'm learning so much and I thought it would be really fun to record it all and share it with you. Today I'm going to show you how I built out the subfloor of my van. So if you are interested in that, stay tuned and let's jump into this video. So here's a look at how I got the van. It was a pretty functional setup, but I really wanted to start from the bare bones so that I could turn this into my tiny home van dream. I only have this footage of me ripping out the carpet, but I ended up taking everything out so I could really start from scratch. Ugh, it's so gross. Ew. Okay. When I removed the previous owner's subfloor, I was super happy to find that there was only a little bit of rust, so I ended up painting over those spots with a rust converter and I let it dry. The next thing I did was use this JB Quick Weld steel reinforced epoxy to seal up all of the holes that were left over from the previous build. After about 4 hours, I checked on the floor and the quick weld had fully cured to create a permanent seal. The only thing I would caution is to make sure you smooth out the putty when you're applying it, otherwise you'll end up with bumps like I have here and you'll have to sand them down before you can build on top of them. Since I had already treated any little rust spots, I just needed to paint the van to cover any exposed metal to prevent the opportunity for new rust to develop. If there are two things that I have been most vigilant about preventing in the van during this build, it's rust and mold. These seem to be the two major downfalls that a lot of van lifers run into. While there are other corners I'm sort of willing to cut during this process, these are the two areas where I don't want to take any chances. After painting the floor, I got to work designing the type of subfloor I wanted. The previous owner's floor was just a piece of plywood directly attached to the metal floor, so there was no insulation. Since I want to be able to take the van anywhere and be in any kind of weather conditions, I knew I wanted to change this in my build. The basic build is a grid that is composed of 4 9-foot furring strips running lengthwise and 8 furring strips of varying lengths spanning the width of the van. Next, I marked where each of the strips intersected. After I finished that up, I used my friend's table saw to cut out notches on all of the boards where the intersections were. Next, I used self-drilling sheet metal screws to attach the grid to the van floor. I thought that this was going to be one of the easiest parts of the build, but as you can obviously see, I'm having a really hard time with screwing these in. It took me a minute to get the hang of it. I realized I was using the wrong drill bit and it was just too loose in the top of the nail head, so it was like wobbling all over the place and it was really tricky, but eventually I figured that out and changed it, and it made the process go a lot faster. So, where do I start? Basically, I had to backtrack a little bit. I finished making the grid and I put it in, and my friend told me it might be a good idea to paint the wood so that it keeps it from getting moldy potentially. Oh, I've got paint all over my face. So obviously, once all of the grid pieces were out, I painted all of the surfaces with a white primer and left them to dry in the sun. Once everything was dry, I refitted all of the pieces and screwed them back in. So I bought some new plywood here. I have the original plywood from when I bought the van, and I was hoping to use that, but there's too much glue on it and I found some mold. Not so much, but enough where it just doesn't really feel like worth it to use it, so I'm going to use that as a stencil and just cut the same shapes out of this new wood, and hopefully we'll have a floor. As you can see, the old plywood had a lot of glue and gunk on it. I tried really hard to get it off, but it just kept gumming up the sandpaper. Plus, since I ended up using new pieces of plywood, I was able to fit the shapes perfectly to the contours of the van. The old pieces were a little bit patchy in some areas, and this way I was just able to have full control to create the foundation that I wanted to create. Once I traced all of the shapes, I laid them out in the van and added any paper wherever it wasn't a perfect fit, and then I taped the whole thing together. I then measured out where I wanted all of the pieces to be cut, making sure that the seams of the plywood floor lined up with the furring strips below to make sure that the plywood would be well supported. Then I laid out the stencil onto new plywood and traced out and cut all of the shapes with a jigsaw. Once all of the pieces were cut to size, I used a combination of sawdust, which I made a lot of in this process, and wood glue to make a paste. And I used this to fill any holes or cracks in the wood in order to make sure that it was as strong as possible. After that, I painted the wood with the same white primer that I've been using for the whole project. I also added a few extra pieces of scrap wood to the back of the van where the plywood was going to hang off, just to add a little extra support. Before I was able to put the plywood floor on top of the grid, I had to insulate. After doing a ton of research, I decided that the type of insulation I wanted to use in my van was wool. This is the most non-toxic and safest option to use, and even though it's a little bit more expensive, based on the health benefits, it's worth the cost. What's cool about wool is that it actually manages the moisture in the air. The process is pretty simple. When the relative humidity is over 65%, the wool actually begins to absorb excess water in the air, and then when the temperature drops down, the moisture begins to dissolve. As I said before, rust and mold are just two issues that you want to avoid in a van, and so managing the condensation with wool was pretty much a no-brainer for me. Once all the plywood was in and fitting perfectly, I measured and marked where all of the furring strips and screws were located underneath the plywood in order to figure out where to screw in the plywood itself. This was very tedious and also definitely more approximate than exact, but I erred on the side of caution as much as possible and ultimately didn't run into any issues. I just marked all of the points where I was going to screw the plywood down, I pre-drilled, and then I just kind of went for it. At some point, I realized that the screws were not lying flush against the plywood, so I decided to try countersinking. So basically, this is super messy, but what the countersink does is creates a hole around the top that's bigger than the screw head, so that it can sink down further. So then you can cover that and sand it smooth and I'm going to put a vinyl flooring over it, and then it should be all really flat and smooth. After that, I just drilled in all of the remaining screws, and now my plywood floor is pretty much good to go. Oh man. So here's a look at the final result. I'm pretty happy with how it all turned out. It's not perfect, but I didn't expect it to be, and I think it's gonna work perfectly for what I am doing. So that's about it. The floor, it's not completely finished. I still need to fill all of the cracks between the pieces of plywood and cover up the screws with some wood filler so that when I put the sheet vinyl on top of it, everything will be really smooth and beautiful. But I'm gonna wait to do that until the end of my build so that I can keep track of where all of the screws are already. I don't want to cover them up. I tried to make a diagram with all of the different measurements of them, but it just is really tedious, and I think this will just be easier. So I'm gonna keep everything uncovered for now, but when I do get to the point where I'm ready to cover it with the sheet vinyl, I will definitely bring you along with me. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you want to follow my journey. I'm super excited to be sharing this with everyone. So I hope that you are safe and well, and I will see you next time. All right, bye.